White initiates with a flexible move maintaining central options. This solid move aims to control space without committing early, a hallmark of positional play. The move the pawn to c5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to d5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to d4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to c5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the d-file takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to e6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e3, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to c4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to a6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to c4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to c6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the pawn to g6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to f6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to e3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to e6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to c3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to d4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White establishes a strong central presence with solidifying the advantage. This push aims for control of key squares. Black develops the knight to a solid positional response maintaining flexibility. This move aids in central influence. White pushes, reinforcing central control and maintaining the initiative. This establishes a strong pawn center. Black captures the pawn with a principled exchange that keeps the game dynamic. This opening up of lines is active. White recaptures with maintaining central dominance. This centralizing maneuver enhances piece activity. Black develops the bishop to a hyper-modern approach eyeing the long diagonal. This bishop aims for distant central control. White plays, positioning the bishop actively and preparing for further development. This solidifies the center. The move the knight to h6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to a5 with check, delivering a check that forces defensive coordination, paving the way for the knight to c3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to d6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to e2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the bishop to e2 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to h3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to d6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to c3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to d7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to b3 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on c3 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move short castles by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to d6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to c3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables short castles to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the knight takes on c6, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the b file takes on c6, executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to h3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the queen to a strategic move coordinating pieces. This centralizing action supports the central pawns. Black recaptures the knight on, simplifying the position. This exchange reduces tactical complexity. White recaptures with maintaining a strong central presence. This preserves the bishop pair advantage. Black plays, reinforcing the pawn structure. This move supports the central pawn complex. White exchanges bishops on, a simplifying move that maintains positional pressure. This clears the diagonal. Black recaptures with adjusting the king's position. This recapture is necessitated by the exchange. White castles kingside, securing the king and connecting the rooks. This completes king safety. The move the pawn to b6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to f6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to c3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to e6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to f7 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the knight to centralizing the piece and preparing for further expansion. This enhances piece coordination. Black develops the bishop to activating the piece along the long diagonal. This bishop aims for queenside influence. White pushes, strengthening the center and preparing for kingside action. This pawn push gains space. Black plays, reinforcing the central pawn chain. This defensive maneuver solidifies the pawn structure. The move the queen to e3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to b3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the queen to c7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook on the f-file to d1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This is reinforced by the queen to c5 with check, gaining a vital tempo with check, unlocking the rook to f2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook on the f-file to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black repositions the knight to a solid defensive move. This improves the knight's coordination. White brings the rook to activating the piece on an open file. This move enhances central control. The move the pawn to e6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to c7, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the pawn to b4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the f-file takes on g5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the knight takes on g5, executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to a3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White pushes, a strong central advance that capitalizes on black's weakness. This pawn push dominates the center. Black captures with a necessary exchange to alleviate central pressure. This opens the f-file. White recaptures with maintaining a strong pawn presence in the center. This pawn controls key squares. The move the knight takes on e5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to h6, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the rook takes on f8, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on f8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the e-file takes on d6, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the knight to f5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the queen takes on e6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the rook takes on f8 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to b5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the rook takes on f1 with check, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on f1, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Whereby the queen to h4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the rook takes on d6, executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight to g4, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with a necessary pawn recapture. This move centralizes the king after the exchange. White maneuvers the knight to targeting weak squares and increasing pressure. This knight aims for outposts. Black repositions the knight to a solid defensive maneuver. This knight defends crucial squares. White captures the pawn with a strong tactical blow. This move exploits the weak pawn structure. Black recaptures with a necessary pawn recapture. This pawn consolidates the center. The move the queen takes on e6 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to e5, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the queen to h4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the queen takes on d6 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Whereby the queen to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the queen to e5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to f7, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black captures the pawn with a tactical exchange that maintains positional pressure. This bishop activates. The move the rook takes on d6 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to e5, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Paving the way for the queen to e7, significantly boosting piece coordination. Next comes the queen to h8 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. Whereby the king to f7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the queen takes on h7 with check, executes a favorable trade. This allows the king to f8, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black centralizes the queen with a strong move that puts pressure on white. This queen activates powerfully. White centralizes the queen to maintaining dynamic tension. This queen activity is noted. The move the queen to c5 with check by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the queen takes on g4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the bishop takes on g4, executes a favorable trade, which enables the bishop to e4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the king to f2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to h5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the queen with a forced recapture that maintains the overwhelming advantage. This king move is necessitated. The move the queen takes on d6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to e8, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the rook to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination. which enables the queen to e7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to f3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to g8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to d4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White checks with a strong move to further consolidate the decisive advantage. This check forces the king. Black moves the king to a necessary king repositioning. This king seeks safer squares. The move the queen takes on a8 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to b7 with check, delivering a check that forces defensive coordination, paving the way for the king to f6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the queen takes on a8, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the king to f5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, allowing the queen to f3 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety. This allows the king to e6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black moves the queen to a solid defensive move, attempting to regroup. This queen centralizes passively. White checks with a strong move to control the board. This check forces further king movement. The move the king to h6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to f6, claiming key space in the center, allowing the queen to f3 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety, which enables the king to e6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to d4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to a3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White maneuvers the queen to a decisive move that seals the victory. This queen controls critical squares.